Section 5. The system of slavery incorporated with organic law in the United States of North America was perhaps the most potent factor in shaping the policy of the national government for generations, and this wicked system was perhaps no less powerful in its bearing upon ecclesiastical relations. About the beginning of the present century, the Reformed Presbyterian Church prohibited slaveholders from entering her fellowship. In several sections of the slave states, especially in South Carolina, members of this church had effected settlements in the last century. The continuance and increasing influence of the system in the general government, and consequently in the southern states, rendered the condition of the Covenanters more and more uncomfortable. Many of them in consequence had removed to the northern states, by courtesy called the Free States. Among these was Reverend Hugh McMillan, followed in succession by many or most of the members of his South Carolina charge. A plan had been devised and a society organized for colonizing emancipated slaves in Africa, their fatherland. This colonization society soon became popular. It was liberally supported by many pious people. Its enthusiastic advocates in towering eloquence pictured a grand republic in Africa, destined soon to evangelize that, quote, dark continent, unquote, a republic which would in time even rival the United States in liberty, religion, and glory. The society was patronized by slaveholders and non-slaveholders alike. In 1828, the aforesaid Mr. McMillan brought before General Assembly the claims of the Colonization Society in a lengthy and eulogistic speech. A unanimous vote followed the address, pledging the Church to the support of the Society. Doubtless, slaveholders, humane and inhuman, from different motives, supported colonization. Infidel editors who hated slavery were not slow to detect the policy and expose the hypocrisy of the taskmasters who favored colonization. Slaveholders, the infidel press affirmed, liberally supported the African Colonization Society, quote, to get rid of the free blacks, unquote, who rendered the tenure of their property insecure by tempting the slaves to strike out for liberty. And they gave a tithe of the profits derived from the unrequited toil of the Negroes to convert the heathen abroad, while by wicked laws prohibiting the education of the heathen at home. Sic licebet nobis ab hoste doceri. Thus the Lord made the infidel an unconscious instrument to teach Covenanters the ultimate object of the colonization scheme. Accordingly, though General Synod in 1834 refused to revive the law of the Church against occasional hearing, the habitual violation of which had severed the body the preceding year in Philadelphia, yet almost all our ministers were converted from the colonization cause. There was, however, one notable exception: Reverend John Cannon. He had been a zealous advocate of the colonization scheme almost from its inception. I had sufficient evidence of this by the fact that so early as 1830 I had incurred Mr. Cannon's displeasure in refusing at his earnest solicitation, while traveling as a licentiate, to become an agent for the circulation of a monthly magazine conducted in the interest of the Colonization Society. Discussion waxed hot in Synod. Mr. Samuel M. Wilson was moderator, and while Mr. Cannon was strongly urging the claims of his favorite society, the moderator's feelings were roused and became uncontrollable. Without leaving the chair, he vociferated, quote, I hold myself prepared to prove that the Colonization Society was a scheme devised to perpetuate slavery, unquote, or words to that effect. Alas, the acrimonious discussions at that meeting furnished lamentable evidence that they were not yet purged from the leaven that rent us asunder the year before. I was then comparatively young in years and in the ministry, yet I was as old as George Gillespie or Hugh Binning when each used his pen in giving to the Church and to the world their unanswerable arguments against, quote, unlawful confederacies, unquote. In my simplicity, I had confidently expected that after 1833 our generation work would be to redeem the promise of 1806 by completing the plan upon which Reformation principles exhibited had been projected, adding the argumentative part. Some of us pressed this important matter on the attention of the Synod, and with such success that Reverend William Sloane was appointed to prepare a paper on, quote, the power of the civil magistrate circa sacra, unquote, and Reverend Moses Roney on the, quote, Arminian controversy, unquote, and here a footnote. Years before my time in the ministry, this matter had been before Synod. Archibald Johnston, as directed by the court, had written on Messiah's headship, and submitted the document to the Synod. It passed into the hands of Reverend S.B. Wiley, that'd be Samuel B. Wiley, and, quote, never saw the light, unquote. The author's father, however, had taken a copy, and at his solicitation, with other friends of the truth, it was first and finally published in 1841 in consecutive numbers to the contending witness, Xena, Ohio. The author died in Cincinnati, 1818, while yet a probationer. Of this young man, I heard Dr. John Black say, quote, Archibald Johnston was the most accomplished orator ever licensed in our church, unquote. Section 6. The General Synod was a delegated body restricted in membership by the presbyteries. The conventional law fixing the ratio of delegation was as follows, quote, if a presbytery had only 2 ministers, both were entitled to be delegates. Of 3 ministers, only 2 could be delegated, and of 4, only 3, etc. The ruling elders were to be equal in number to the ministers. This constitutional law of delegation was frequently violated by dominant parties. General Synod met only biennially. The 2 subordinate synods had been created by the General Synod, and to them was assigned all business requiring judicial cognizance within their respective bounds during the years which intervened between the meetings of General Synod. The Allegheny Mountains constituted a natural boundary between the eastern and western sub-synods. The question of slavery had excited much feeling, as already noticed, in General Synod in 1834. In the fall of the following year, the anti-slavery sentiment of surrounding communities still increasing, the Western Subordinate Synod passed a resolution that each minister in synod should preach a sermon before next meeting on the subject of slavery. To the general surprise, 1 vote was heard in the negative. This came from Reverend Samuel McKinney, and here a footnote. This gentleman had been brought up amid slaves in the state of Tennessee, and in time confirmed the truth by his example that, quote, evil company doth corrupt good manners, unquote. He was nephew to the, quote, great McKinney, unquote, who wrote that masterly and original work, The Rights of God, and something great was generally expected from the nephew, yet he hardly rose to the rank of mediocrity. Often did I hear him pray with seeming fervor that the, quote, witnesses might have patience to wear the sackcloth a little longer, unquote. After a short pastorate among us, he left the church, joined the General Assembly, and went south to Texas. He and Mr. Hugh Walkinshaw had professed a good profession before many witnesses about the time of their licensure, and of course had gained the confidence of the sounder part of the church. But in time these two ministers developed quite different traits of character. The anti-slavery sentiment was rapidly crystallizing in surrounding society when the General Synod met in Allegheny City in 1836. Since the majority of the members had been by popular breeze already detached from the colonization society to which a unanimous pledge had been given in 1828, the reader may easily anticipate that the feelings which found expression from the moderator's chair and on the floor of Synod would be greatly intensified. Among the papers laid on Synod's table, bearing upon both doctrine and discipline, for conflicting views had already engendered disorders, a memorial and petition came up from the congregation of Brush Creek. The purport of the document was that the public ear being generally opened, Synod would give more point and publicity to the church's testimony. This paper indicated the course which the conservative part of the church desired to pursue. But alas, it soon appeared that these were already in the position of a hopeless minority, the majority of the ministers being inveigled in the popular confederacies. It may not be improper here to advert to the public conduct of some who at this meeting rendered themselves conspicuous, rather more by their zeal than by their influence. Two only are selected as examples, one of the junior and one of the senior ministers. Reverend James M. Wilson appeared for the first time as a member of court. He was the eldest son of a distinguished father, Reverend James R. Wilson, Doctor of Divinity. His aspect to a stranger was that, of a stripling, yet in his teens. Tall and slim, he seemed equally full of zeal and self-confidence. Of voluble tongue and long-winded, he also attempted to occupy the floor oftener than the rules of the House permitted. So persistent and protracted were his speeches that old and gray-headed members could scarcely obtain a hearing, as the saying is, quote, "get a word in edgewise," unquote. This conduct in a young man, for the first time a member of Synod, appeared to some of us, also junior members, to be disorderly and very unseemly. He was full of the exciting and popular feeling of the time. Not less so was the conduct of Reverend James McGillen, one of the senior members. His zeal became enthusiastic, and, in the heat of discussion, sometimes degenerated into a perfect craze. The moderator, knowing how to manipulate and make the best use of those of his party, appointed Mr. Milligan chairman of the special committee to which the memorial from Brush Creek was referred. Since the year 1828, the greater part of the ministry had become convinced of the pernicious effect of the endorsement given by Synod at that date to the Colonization Society, not because of the corrupting confederacies resulting from said endorsement, but because of the deception involved in that plausible scheme when Mr. Milligan brought in the committee's report on the Brush Creek Memorial, instead of regarding the petition of the memorialists by framing some scriptural arguments to give point and publicity to the Church's testimony against slavery. The report merely recommended, quote, that Synod transfer its patronage from the Colonization to the Abolition Society, unquote. Every reader may perceive, as it may be assumed every member of Synod perceived, that the committee's report, instead of granting the prayer of the petitioners, proposed that Synod should lead the whole Church on a side issue, merely opposition to slavery. Quote, nature itself teacheth, unquote, that slavery is a moral wrong. A man does not need to become a Christian to be an abolitionist. The report was considered as an evasion of the matter referred to the committee and an implied insult to the court. It was referred back to the committee with instructions. Next day the chairman returned with the report substantially as before, quote, that the Synod transfer its patronage from the Colonization Society to the Anti-Slavery Society, unquote. The persistence of the chairman produced general and visible irritation among the members. A motion was made that the report be again returned to the committee with peremptory orders to remodel and forthwith complete it. This proved too much for Mr. Milligan. He declared he could not, that he would not report otherwise, etc. He then became exasperated, and with tears exclaimed, quote, I would rather live in the center of Africa than... His emotions rendered inaudible the rest of the sentence. Some members moved that the report be amended and completed in court by substituting for the, quote, Abolition Society, unquote, the words, quote, cause of abolition, unquote. This amendment was accepted, and the report adopted to read as follows, quote, that Synod transfer its patronage from the Colonization Society to the cause of abolition, unquote. From this decision, Lusk and Steele caused their dissent to be entered on the minutes. A considerable number asked to have their dissents also marked. Among these I distinctly remember Reverend James Ferris and Elder Samuel Wright. At this juncture, Mr. Milligan's paroxysm had so far subsided that he had presence of mind to promptly resort to a technical expedient. He asked, quote, Moderator, do these members vote in the negative? Unquote. They replied that they had not voted either way. Mr. Milligan instantly said, quote, then, Moderator, according to rule, silent votes go with the majority, unquote. Aspirants for popularity and leaders in defection published through the Church that only 2 had voted in the negative. It was evident on the minutes, namely, Steele and Lusk. And some of the brethren thenceforth designated them in derision as, quote, the 2 witnesses, unquote.